lesson, we are starting our Civil War unit. And kind of want you to think about this like a story, right? Like you're watching a movie. And the first thing you have in most stories and most movies would be what's called exposition. And that's the setup, okay? You get to know the characters, you get to know some of the background before you jump into the real action of the story, okay? And I'm gonna pause real quick and just give you a spoiler alert. The North ends up winning the war and this country stays together. That's the end of our story. I think we all know that because we're still one country, right? But it doesn't mean that this isn't worth studying still, okay? Because this was a very divided time in our country, and it's worth seeing how was the North able to both win this war and keep the country together. And that's really what our two main essential questions are for the unit. That's our big focus, okay? Now, I want you to imagine sort of what might be the opening scene to this movie. And what I'm going to go ahead and go with is say that perhaps Abraham Lincoln, President Abraham Lincoln, is in his office on the day of his inauguration, okay? And we know what he's been through, you know, in those recent months. He was elected in November of 1860, and at that time, the country was struggling, but it was still one country. Over the 4 months following that, before his inauguration, 7 states seceded because they were upset about him being elected because he wanted to stop the spread of slavery, okay? So when he's getting inaugurated, which is when he's actually sworn in, you know, he's sitting there, you know, and I'm kind of imagining this, but like he's probably sitting in his office right before he gives his speech, and he's probably thinking, you know, those southern states that seceded, you know, it's probably too late for them, and there's probably a good chance that we're going to go to war with them. But he did have something that a focus that he could do to make things better, and that's holding on to the border states, okay? Now, you might not know what I mean by the border states, so I'm going to go ahead actually and pause the music. I'm going to use this chance to go over some vocab. So the first thing is inauguration. I already mentioned that. Hopefully you picked up on the fact that that is when the president is actually sworn into office. So we always elect our president in November, but then they don't actually start as president. They're not inaugurated until January for us. When Lincoln was elected, it was March, okay? And then when I said border states, I was referring to there are 4 states that were on the border between the North and the South. And those states had remained as a part of the United States, but slavery was legal there, okay? And so Lincoln was very worried about these states because, you know, if they were like, I don't know, Lincoln, you know, is trying to stop the spread of slavery and got worried and seceded as well, it would make it even harder for the North to win if there were a civil war, okay? So this little map kind of shows you the blue states are the North, the gray states are the South, the states that have seceded, and then you see these 4 states, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware along the border that at that point had remained in the Union, in the United States, but still, you know, had slavery legal. Okay, so I'm gonna put my music back on and let's just go ahead and finish this opening scene. So Lincoln is there and he's thinking about, you know, how do I make sure these border states remain in our country? And what he ends up doing is he gives his inauguration speech, but instead of focusing a lot on the fact that he wanted to stop the spread of slavery, he decided to focus instead on the idea of keeping the Union together, right? And that was one of his major focuses. And it accomplished the goal that he was going for. The border states, you know, felt assured by his inaugural address, and they decided to stay in the Union. The thing that he couldn't stop was the fact that the war was coming. And eventually, at Fort Sumter, which is in South Carolina, the Southern troops there wanted to kick out the the federal government troops that were in Fort Sumter because they said, hey, this is our country. You aren't in here anymore. We're not part of the United States. We have our own country. And they began firing in Fort Sumter to the point where the northern troops had to surrender and go back up north and leave Fort Sumter. So that's kind of the setup right there. All right, I'm going to go ahead and stop our music again. And I will say it's probably not a surprise to you guys that it was South Carolina who were the ones who fired on Fort Sumter and officially started the Civil War, given that they were the ones who nullified the North's law earlier when we were talking about tariffs, that tariff law. And they were also the first state to secede from the Union. And now they're the ones who started the war. So a lot of the heart of these issues started with South Carolina. Okay, now let's talk a bit more about kind of the setup we're going to look into today, the exposition to our story. So I just wanted to read you this quote real quick. This is from The Art of War, and it says, "If you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. If you know yourself but not the enemy, for every victory gained, you will also suffer a defeat. If you know neither the enemy nor yourself, you will succumb in every battle." Okay, so it's basically saying before any kind of battle, you have to know both yourself and your enemy. Okay, and that's kind of our focus today, is like, you got to kind of know what your strengths and weaknesses are and what your enemy's strengths and weaknesses are. And today, as a part of this exposition, this background we want to look at basically who had the advantage, the North or the South, in a lot of different areas. And so let's go ahead and just do a quick stop and jot. Go ahead and jot down in your social studies notebook, what are the different areas in which one side or the other could have had an advantage, right? Think of all the different ways in which one side might have had an advantage going into the war. Okay, go and do that now. Okay, hopefully you paused the video and did that. I'm going to go ahead and reveal the ones we're going to talk about today. So here are some areas in which one side might be able to have an advantage over the others, right? Economic strength, that means who had more money, who had the ability to produce more things like guns and food and the different supplies that you would need, okay? Transportation, right? Because you got to transport soldiers and supplies all around the country for battles. Who had the most natural resources basically to draw on in order to produce things, who had the most and best soldiers, who had the best weapons, who had the best military leaders, and who had the best military strategy, okay? So if we're going to study like how did the North win this war, well, let's look at, first of all, just who had the different advantages going in, okay? So here's what your assignment is. It's called, it's a Civil War Advantages worksheet here, and it tells you what reading you're going to use. You're going to be in 9.3, tabs 3 through 5. And essentially for each of those areas, you're just going to put in this first box either North, South, or even based on who you think had the advantage in that area, okay? And guess how you're going to find that out? You're going to find it in Discovery Ed. So you're going to have to do the reading to figure it out. And then the why is just, give a couple examples that you saw from the reading that explained why the North had an advantage or the South had an advantage in that way, okay? Now I'm actually going to go and do the first one for you just to model it. So let me go to the reading. So we're looking at economic strength here, okay? I'm going to go ahead and just read these first two paragraphs, and let's see if we can figure out who had the advantage in economics going into this war. So it says, as the war began, the North had more money. It also had a thriving economy based on manufacturing. Almost 90% of American factories were located in the North. More than 25% of the Northern population lived in cities. Many Northerners worked in manufacturing, especially factories. Agriculture was largely done by machines in the North. This required fewer people to produce food. In 1860, the North produced half the corn, most of the wheat, and almost all of the oats for the entire nation. This was accomplished even though only 40% of the population in the North was involved in farming. The Union states were able to produce more than the Confederate states in almost every area. Northern manufactured goods were happy to convert their factories to produce weapons. They knew the federal government would be a good customer. The Union was able to provide weapons and supplies to its soldiers at a much faster pace than the Confederacy. So let's just do one more stop and jot. based on what you've read, stop and jot whether you think the North or the South had the advantage in terms of their economic strength. Go for it. Okay, hopefully you did that. And hopefully you said the North, right? They had the advantage in almost every way from what we read there. So all you gotta do is literally just write North there, okay? They had the advantage. And then why is you just have to give some examples showing why, right? So we saw in there that said the North had more money. It had more factories to produce weapons and other supplies. And it also produced more food, which that might seem really weird because the South had more farms than the North. But actually, there's more to this section, and I'm not going to take the time to read all of it out loud to you, but it goes over how most of the southern farms produced cotton and tobacco and actually didn't have that many farms that produced food, okay? So I'm going to add that fact as well from reading that second section because that's also an important fact. So I'm also going to put the South had a lot of farms but produced mostly cotton and tobacco and not much food. Okay, so if I'm going to pick the North, the best answer shows me, well, what was so good about what the North had in economic strength, and it shows how the South was weaker in economic strength. Okay, and that's a good response right there. Just a couple last things as you guys do this. You'll notice this section says Southern resources. Don't get that confused with natural resources, okay? Because if you look at the reading, natural resources is a different section towards the end. So I did the first one for you, and that covers really those first two sections there, okay? Your opening section and your Southern resources. You're gonna start at transportation and go ahead and answer that one there. And you're just gonna go all the way down through tabs 3 through 5 and cover the rest of the topics. Okay. The last thing I want to make sure you're aware of is that some of these answers you're going to have to infer, right? So that means it's not always going to say the South had the better blank or the North had the better blank. It's just going to describe what each one had, and you have to decide which one seems to have the advantage. One example would be military strategy. I can tell you right now, they're not going to tell you which one is better, but I want you to read about both strategies, and I want you to think about what sounds like they had a better plan, which side, okay? So that's all I've got for the video. Just make sure you finish the worksheet for your assignment today. And if you have any questions, message me through Google Classroom. All right, have a good one, guys.